Welcome to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show with your hosts, Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet. Phil and Ted's guest today is actor, author, and professor Armin Shimerman, best known for playing Quark in the TV series Deep Space Nine. Armin's a professor of William Shakespeare's life and works and shares amazing stories that will flip your Elizabethan wig. And now, your sexy boomer hosts, Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet.
Welcome to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show. I'm Ted Bonnet.
Well, that means I must be Phil Proctor.
How are you?
How am I?
Yeah, you look just lovely.
Well, thank you. Yes, I've gained weight and lost it.
Mm-hmm. You really fill out a bathing suit now.
I'm wearing a bathing suit now. Why? Because we are at the lovely home of Armin Shimerman and Kitty Swinks over in the Valley somewhere. And I'm looking at a beautiful swimming pool because we're doing this recording under a gorgeous gazebo.
Yeah.
And that means that sitting across from me is Armin Shimerman.
That must be me, I guess. Yes, absolutely.
We're in the beautiful backyard of Armin's house. We were in bunkers for so long, doing the show from bunkers remotely. So now we've decided to just invite ourselves to our guests' homes.
Well, thank you. It's very nice of you to come, though I lost out on my travel pay.
Armin, you're an actor, you are a teacher, you're an author, and
I was a union activist. I was a journalist at one time. I was a caddy at one time.
Oh, you were?
That's where I got these shoulders, was from carrying two bags at the same time.
Wow.
Carrying two bags was always very good money.
And you got a lot of walking in because you had to go from one person to the other and back and forth and keep your eye on both those balls. But it was a lovely job, and then years ago, I got the opportunity to play caddy again, this time on Seinfeld. But none of my experience came into play for that, so it's okay.
And you're perhaps best known for your longtime role on the Star Trek series Deep Space Nine.
As Snark.
As Quark.
Snark is what my fellow actors called me, yeah.
Did they? Because you were kind of a snarky Quark.
I was a snarky Quark. I was very lucky to play Quark. When I heard that the new Star Trek series that was about to be produced, Deep Space Nine, and I heard that there was a Ferengi on it. I had played Ferengi on the previous Star Trek series, Next Generation, and I thought, well, they must be looking for somebody like me.
They were looking for an Armin Shimerman type. A Ferengi type.
A Ferengi type. Get me a young Ferengi. And at that time I wasn't so young, I was 40. But I auditioned and was very happy and lucky to get hired. I'm very proud to say that on that show, I was the first actor hired for the show. That there were 7 series regulars in that first season, and of the 7, I was the first one hired because they had seen me play a Ferengi before.
Wonderful.
For people who don't know, what is a Ferengi?
What is a Ferengi? A Ferengi, what is a Ferengi? You know, I've never been asked that question, Ted. That's amazing. What is a Ferengi? A Ferengi is an alien creature from the planet Ferenginar, and they are acquisitive beings. They like to accumulate things, and they like to trade back and forth. Originally, when I first played them in Next Generation, they were described to me as clipper captains, American clipper captains from the 1800s, from New England. Very hard-nosed sort of people. But unfortunately, they hired me for that first episode, and they became overnight sort of comical characters. Yeah.
Very funny.
Yes.
The scene where your character was lodging a complaint about living underneath your superior officer and making noises because he was shape-shifting all night and it was bothering you. And your character says at one point, I could even hear the mouse when he scampers like a mouse. And this commander woman character says, you could hear that? And you point to your ears and say, hello. It's very funny.
The irony of ironies is all the actors who played Ferengi had large prosthetic ears.
Yeah.
But because we had large prosthetic ears, which were made of rubber, we couldn't hear. Because it was like wearing, big earplugs.
Right.
Did you take liberty with the character and make it more comedic?
I did originally. It wasn't something I wanted to do. I actually was trying to be dramatic on Next Generation, and it came out very comical.
Well, that's what they say, though, Armin. If you're going to play comedy, you got to play it straight.
Absolutely, Phil. And when I auditioned for Quark on Deep Space Nine, my good friend, he wasn't my good friend then, but later on became a very close friend. He was my brother on the show. His name is Max Grudenchik. We both auditioned for the character of Quark, and we sat down on the steps of Paramount, and we discussed our auditions. This is before either one of us had the role. And I said, Max, how did you approach this role? And he said, as you said, Phil, he said comedically, because they're comic characters. And he said, how did you approach it? And I said, following your advice, Phil, I said, no, I approached it dramatically, that I wanted to make it as dramatic as possible, even though they're comedic characters. And I suppose the producers, the powers that be, agreed with you, Phil. They took the dramatic approach over the comedic approach, although Max would have made a great Quark as well.
Yes, I think the secret of that, from an actor's perspective, is that the audience gets to be funny. The audience gets to have the fun, because they feel superior to you in a certain way. What a jerk!
But you're taking it very seriously, which makes you a jerk.
Yes.
But you must not ever think that you're a jerk. You simply want what you want.
That's right.
So as Deep Space Nine took the concept and made it a little broader, I mean, there seemed to be more humanity in these aliens.
Yeah, I think one of the glories of our show, of Deep Space Nine, was it wasn't about boldly going to some planet and solving their problems in 47 minutes, but rather it was about a long, extended view into relationships. How do people who don't necessarily like each other live with each other? How do we live together in a society that is partisan? How do we live together in a society that is abrasive against each other? And our show tried not to show you how to do that. Absolutely not. We did not do that. But we explored the problems and the successes of that situation.
And people could identify with that.
I think so. Now I'm very prejudiced about this, but I think that's why our show has stood up so well to the test of time, because we weren't about technical things so much. We were, of course, but not really. We were about relationships, and relationships are universal.
And there was one monologue that was sort of a morality play. You weren't playing for laughs.
Yes.
In the scene, you were talking about false equivalency. It was like, you think you're superior to us? We may do this, we may do that. We always may be looking for a deal, but we're not killing each other.
Yes, I remember that monologue. That was one of my favorite monologues, actually. I believe I was saying that to Captain Sisko.
Yes.
From the very beginning of Star Trek, the character of Spock, everyone knows Spock, he had the ability to look at humanity and make judgments or appraisals of humanity. And so for those of us who were aliens, we often got what I would call the Spock speech. We would get a speech where the writers are making comments about human characteristics, human values, that only an outsider, an alien, can make.
I heard one very funny story. You were on the set in '94 during the earthquake.
It's about the earthquake, sure. On that particular morning, my calls were usually about 5 o'clock in the morning, because my makeup took 2 hours to apply every day. And so at 7 o'clock, when the camera crew was ready, I was ready to go at 7, so I would come in at 5. So this particular morning, and I don't know why, but they had called me in, I believe, at 4 instead of at 5. My makeup artist, who applied my prosthetic makeup, her name is Karen Westerfield, she had put my prosthetics on. She had glued my rubber head on.
Your dome.
My dome and the face mask as well, because there was 2 parts, the dome and the face mask.
Mm-hmm.
And the earthquake came. Actually, we weren't shook up that much because we were in a makeup trailer, and although the city shook, we were sort of stabilized by the.
You're on shocks.
Yeah, but we found out pretty quickly what had happened. I mean, for me, the most telling thing that I remember was walking outside. It was still dark, and looking up at the sky, and seeing stars. Seeing stars in the sky.
No light.
No light. And I went, whoa. That was the most telling thing of that morning, except for what I'm about to tell you. And at that time, we didn't have cell phones, although somebody had something like a cell phone.
Yeah, mobile phone.
That's it, a mobile phone.
Mm-hmm. Big
He called his wife. His house hadn't been shook very much. I finally got in touch with my wife and found out here in the valley that we had been rocked quite a bit. The perimeter walls around the property had come down. The French doors had all been blown open. The dogs had gone frantic. And she was in rather shook-up state. And I said, well, I'll be home as soon as I can. So I went to the AD and said, I'm going home. Now, understand, I'm still in my dome and face mask.
Ferengi makeup.
And I'm not going to wait to have it taken off because it takes an hour to unglue that.
Wow.
And I didn't want to wait an hour. And my makeup lady, Karen, luckily for me, lived about 2 miles from where I live now. And I said to Karen, come over to my house with your materials, you know, and take it off after you've checked your house and your family and everything. So we agreed on that. The AD actually said to me, you can't leave. My contract with Paramount said that I could not leave the lot in makeup.
Oh.
That was forbidden. And he said, so you can't leave. And I said, well, I'm not waiting around to have this taken off. I'm taking off now. And he gave me an argument for about 30 seconds or so.
It's his job.
That's his job, and he fulfilled his job. And I said, you know, screw you, I'm going. And he said, fine, I'll see you tomorrow. So I'm driving from the Paramount lot to my home in the valley. And because of the earthquake, because I remembered in our last major earthquake in Los Angeles, one particular area of freeway had fallen down. So I took the local roads. And the people in Los Angeles were incredibly gracious that morning. There were no street lights working, no traffic lights working. And so people were very kind about letting the person on the right go through the intersection first. I got to an intersection, and understand, I've got my Ferengi prosthetics on. The other thing I should tell you is I can't drive without glasses. And so in order to drive, I'm holding my glasses out in front of my face because I can't get them around the head. That's impossible. So I've got my glasses out in front of me. I'm at an intersection. There's a gentleman in a large truck facing me. And what you can't see on the radio, but for Phil and Ted's amusement, I will show them what this guy looked like, which was like this.
Oh, that was good.
His mouth was agape. His eyes were disbelieving and bugged out. And then all of a sudden, he very graciously just waved me through the intersection. Though it wasn't my turn, he just waved me through the intersection. And for the rest of the week, actually, I kept an eye on the Inquirer to see if anybody reported any aliens during the earthquake. But there was no stories.
You know, that reminds me of the scene from Close Encounters where Dreyfus is sitting in his truck and a UFO gets behind him with those bright lights and he just waves you, go on.
Go on.
And it goes up and over the car. Wow.
So it was, you know, and I came home, and the nice thing was, although my wife had seen me many times on the lot with the makeup on, many times, when I came home with the makeup, she started to laugh, which was a very pleasant sound considering what the morning had done to her. And ironically, we had had tickets the night before to go see Bill Irwin in a show.
Love him.
And because my call was so early, 4 o'clock in the morning, I said to my wife, listen, take somebody else, go. And I'm going to sleep in the master bedroom. And when you come in, don't wake me up. Go into the guest bedroom and go to sleep. So I got up, went to work. She was in the guest bedroom. She was woken up by the earthquake. When the earthquake happened, the TV cabinet had tipped over. The TV and the cabinet had fallen on the bed in the master bedroom. So if she had slept there, she might have been crushed, or at least hurt.
Yeah.
Wow.
And luckily for us, she had been in the guest bedroom where there was no such contraption, and she escaped injury that way. So that was very nice.
Here we have a major earthquake, and yet you're told you can't leave because you may shatter the illusion, and that somehow supersedes your actual life.
Yes.
This is a rule at Disney World.
Oh, for the characters?
The characters that walk around. As you can imagine, in the summer in Orlando, those outfits they wear are stifling.
No one knows
right?
better than I.
And the rule is, If you collapse from heat exhaustion, you are not allowed to be revived. They can't take your head off. They have to drag you, and they have a series of trapdoors all around the park to immediately evacuate these people, put them behind walls, and then take the helmet off. They're not allowed to do it in front of the guests.
Off with his head.
You're listening to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show with our special guest, Armin Shimerman. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show with Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet. To hear all the Sexy Boomer shows, go to sexyboomershow.com. Tell your friends about the Sexy Boomer Show and help us build our audience. To be notified when a new episode is posted, press the subscribe button in your podcast player. And if you'd like to toss something in the tip jar to help our habit, look for the donate button on our website, sexyboomershow.com. And for $20, we'll send you a swell Sexy Boomer Show bumper sticker that will help you get lucky. Back to Phil and Ted and their special guest, actor, author, and professor Armin Shimerman.
Now, I want to connect some things in your life. Not only are you well known for doing this wonderful alien comic, culturally changing character.
Thank you, Phil.
You are a Shakespearean scholar and a teacher, a professor, associate professor.
Associate professor.
Right.
USC.
Still working at it. Keep practicing.
Thank you.
And an author. And in fact, I have in my hand your latest work, Illyria, Book 1, and it's called Betrayal of Angels. Could you tell me a little bit about this series?
Sure. So I've been writing novels for a very long time. In fact, long before I wanted to be an actor, I wanted to be a writer.
Aha.
And it's always been in the back of my mind, but I was seduced by the dark side of the Force and became an actor. But it didn't stop me from wanting to write. And I have written another trilogy, which was a science fiction trilogy, which was easy to do because I was a science fiction actor. Mm-hmm. But in that trilogy, which is called the Merchant Prince trilogy, I wrote about a historical character named Dr. John Dee, a very famous or infamous person from Elizabethan England. But that character in the Merchant Prince series was more about my character from Deep Space Nine than it was about John Dee. Although we called him John Dee, but it was more Quark than it was John Dee. And I sort of promised the spirit of John Dee that one day I would write a series of novels about the historical John Dee and keep Quark out of it. So this prompted this idea that I had of John Dee being sort of a Sherlock Holmes type, solving a problem that Elizabethan England was going through, which was the bitter rivalry or hatred, really, between the Protestants and the Catholics of Elizabethan times, not only in England but in Europe as well. England, of course, at that time was a Protestant country, or at least the national religion was Protestant, but there were many, many, many Catholics, especially in the north of England, who had to secretly go to Mass. Mass was forbidden pretty much after 1570 when the Pope excommunicated Queen Elizabeth.
And Shakespeare, William Shakespeare's father, was purported to be a secret Catholic.
Right, and it is one of the great mysteries that someday will be solved. Was Shakespeare a practicing Catholic because his father was a Catholic? Or was he a practicing Protestant because the only way you could get work in the court was to be a Protestant? If you were Catholic, they would not give you work. That was forbidden. So my novel is about testing the loyalty of a particular count in the English Channel. England has jurisdiction over several islands in the English Channel. Jersey, for instance, or
White. Isle of Wight.
Isle of Wight, and there are a couple of others. And in my imagination, I saw one of these islands as a halfway house or a underground station to bring priests into England to worship Mass.
To Mass.
And this was happening. This is historically true.
Wow.
But not about the island. But priests were smuggled into England so that Mass could be worshipped. So I started writing this actually while I was in my trailer of Deep Space Nine. And I decided in this novel, also to bring in a very young William Shakespeare at the age of 16 as a sort of a sidekick. But as things would have it, although Dee was always meant to be the lead character, and he is,
Yes.
Shakespeare's character grew and grew and grew and became almost an equal, a co-equal in the books as well. Because we do not know how Shakespeare became Shakespeare.
That's right.
How did this young kid from a small town in Warwickshire, how did this kid get to be so knowledgeable and so good a writer without a university education, without any real education at all? How did that happen? We don't know how that happened. So my premise is, John Dee, among the many things that he did, had the largest library in England at the time. He was a master educator. He was a master mathematician. Like Erasmus, people would come from all over Europe to visit him to learn more about what he knew. So I have them linked up so that Shakespeare can learn from this incredible scholar, and it's from his relationship with John Dee that it becomes the writer that we all know him to be. So they're trying to solve the mystery of, on the island, who is the person protecting these what's called seminary priests and getting them into England secretly. My premise is that Dee is educating Will Shakespeare while both of them are trying to solve the riddle of this crime. And the island, by the way, is not called Jersey, and it's not called the Isle of Wight or any of the other islands, but rather is called Illyria, which is the island that Shakespeare uses in Twelfth Night. And I combined a lot of history with the characters of Twelfth Night. So it's both a historical novel and a fantastical novel at the same time. Dee is educating Shakespeare into literature, into writing, into literary allusions, history, rhetoric, all the things that was taught at university. Dee is teaching Will, and he is becoming a better writer as he studies. In the meantime, he gets an occupation with the count that they're investigating, whose name is Orsino, Count Orsino.
Oh, okay, Orsino.
And he becomes Orsino's court poet while he's in Illyria. Now, so when I sold the novel, and the publishers were very nice about buying it, they made the mistake of not asking me when they bought it, how many words do you have? They eventually did ask me that after all the paperwork was signed, and when they realized how large the novel was, they insisted that it wasn't one book, it was 3 books. And the deal we made was that each book would come out each November. On November the 5th, which happens to be my birthday.
Oh, nice coincidence.
And Guy Fawkes Day, which is a holiday in England. So the first book is out. Betrayal of Angels is out. The second book, which I haven't got a title for, book 2, will come out next November.
Call it Proctor's Revenge.
Okay, Proctor's Revenge it is. And the third one, will be Ted's Happiness.
Oh, great. As you said, this is a story about not so merry old England.
Yeah, because we've heard that expression, merry old England, and the truth is it wasn't so merry. The average age of a Londoner in Shakespeare's time was about 22. People died from the plague. People died from accidents. People died from any disease. It didn't have to be from the plague. People were killed off by the government or by each other. It wasn't pleasant, and certainly people in the lower ends of society were starving, were mutilated. It wasn't pleasant. They drank a lot. I mean, the amount of mead that was drunk.
Well, water was dangerous.
Water was
days.
dangerous. Everything was dangerous about life at that time. England was a backwater country compared to most of Europe, and they were coming out of that, but it was not a pleasant place to be. And Shakespeare took his life in his hands, literally, to go from Warwickshire to London, and probably why he never visited his wife that often, because it was a dangerous journey back and forth.
Of course.
Because even if you didn't die of disease or anything, you could be robbed, you could be murdered. Absolutely.
Sure.
So as a professor of Shakespeare, it's an opportunity to ask you, for people who aren't familiar with Shakespeare, someone who would like to learn a little more, would like to find an in. Do you have a particular way of doing that for students?
I do, actually. Usually what's off-putting about Shakespeare is the language. And the truth of the matter is, most of the language is current language. You know, people say, oh, it's Old English. It's not Old English. Old English is, when that opera with Yeshua Suta, the Ruchtemar, Chepersa to the Ruta. And that's actually not Old English. That's Middle English. Chaucer, right. So it's really modern English. What's off-putting is the way the words are put together. The modern words are put together. It's in a style that we are not familiar with, mainly because it's written in a rhetorical style. And rhetoric, although still taught, but not very much, was absolutely what was taught through the Middle Ages up until, I would say, the beginning of the 20th century. And in America, for whatever reason, they really stopped teaching that as fundamental English. But when you begin to recognize the rules of rhetoric, when you understand why these words are put together in the manner that they're put together, and begin to accept that as part of your understanding of English, then the language becomes exponentially clearer. Now, there's still going to be some trade terms that we may not be familiar with. If this was a mercantile society, it was a society that made its money off of shipping. So there's a lot of shipping terms and a lot of horse wrangling terms and a lot of terms that were everyday usages to people who lived in that time, but aren't necessarily so to us today. Many of them still are used, but we're not as familiar with those crafts as these people were. And also sometimes words have slightly changed a tiny bit. One of the ones that I'm particularly fond of is the word F-R-O-M, from. In Shakespeare, for us, from means from, as we understand it.
Moving away from.
Yes, moving. But even more so in Shakespeare, actually that's the very definition that Shakespeare would use, Phil. There's a great sense of divorce in the word from. So my example to my class usually is, I can tell you that I am from New Jersey, and you'll understand that. But if Shakespeare wrote that line, he would expect his actor to say, in this sort of way, I am from New Jersey. There's a great sense of divorce, that never going back. This is from any understanding.
If you lived in New Jersey, you would want to be from New Jersey.
And I am from
New Jersey.
So, and there are other words that we use all the time, but we never think about. For instance, the figures of speech. Why are they called figures of speech? And this is actually goes back to rhetoric. The hundreds of ways to put words together all have their own individual Greek name. And that collection of Greek names for ways to put words together are all called figures.
Go figure.
Well, that's a different figure.
Oh.
The thing that is essential, unfortunately, for those who are thinking about learning more about Shakespeare, is to have a very good dictionary, because you need. Sometimes you are misled by a word that you think you know, you absolutely know you know, but the word has changed its meaning or has a double meaning. I mean, look at the word Czech, for instance. Czech can mean someone from Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
Czech can mean give me the bill at the end of a meal. Czech can be check out the woman who just walked by.
The figure on that woman.
That's right.
So speak.
And I'm sure there are 3 or 4 other checks.
You can write a check, too.
You can write a check, exactly. So they're
check off the list.
Check off the list. It goes on and on. So oftentimes we have a limited awareness of what a word means when it means what it means today, but it also has another meaning. Mm-hmm. For instance, again, my favorite example is want. For us, want means I desire something. I want a coffee. I desire a coffee. But if Shakespeare writes, I want a coffee, he means there's no coffee here.
Right.
We're lacking.
I need a coffee. There's no
in
coffee.
want of a nail, the war was lost.
It would be interesting for people who are getting into Shakespeare to maybe read an electronic version of it where they can tap on a word and get an instantaneous explanation.
You know what? If the instantaneous translation includes some archaic definitions, or a sufficient amount of definitions, I think that's a very good idea.
Well, listen, in Shakespearean's time, they would have a monk sitting at your feet while you were reading.
Not a monk. Catholics are forbidden in England.
Oh, so it would be what's the word for a scribe?
A scribe, a scrivener.
Right, and you tap him on the head.
That's right, and he tells you what the word means.
He tell you the different meanings of the word.
Yeah.
For someone who would know nothing about Shakespeare, but is curious, why is it worth the effort?
Great. Okay. For two reasons. First and foremost, primary reason. Very few writers have ever succeeded in explaining the human condition as well as Shakespeare has. And he's able to do it in a few words. Just a couple of words put together suddenly crystallize exactly a human emotion, a human response to things. And the way he puts words together are so galvanizing that it just gives you an epiphany about your own humanity.
To be or not to be?
That is the question. And that, by the way, is a figure called antithesis. And
Right.
it's because it's an opposite. If you recognize this as the figure of antithesis, it's an opposite. To be, or the opposite, not to be. And that's the rhetorical figure of antithesis. And so, not only do you recognize that, but you understand why he wrote it the way he wrote it. He's using that figure to write that line. And antithesis is absolutely Shakespeare's favorite figure of rhetoric. He uses it constantly. And as long as you begin to see the relationship, the tension between these opposites, you have a better understanding and a better appreciation. You can still understand, but you have a better appreciation of what's being said.
So if you say, I want to be, you're saying both I need to be and I don't think I can be.
Exactly. Precisely.
What works would you recommend as a starter?
My novel.
Illyria.
Illyria. And the reason is, and I'm slightly being facetious, but it gives you a very good understanding of the history of the times. And that, too, is part and parcel of the misunderstanding of people. Because if people don't understand what was happening at that time, they can't relate to the characters as well. Because Shakespeare's learning about rhetoric from John Dee, you'll get some principles of rhetoric in my novel as well.
No one really knows how William Shakespeare learned what he learned to be able to write this.
We don't know. He didn't go to university. He was always in conflict with the writers, and there were many wonderful dramatists at the time. Shakespeare is not the only dramatist of the time. There were really great writers at that time, but they're all overshadowed by Shakespeare.
Was it like Johnson and Bacon?
Yeah, Johnson and Bacon and Nash, Greene.
Yeah, and they all kind of hung out. They knew one another. They tried to kill one another.
Exactly, and they were in bitter feuds with each other. And all of them, except Shakespeare, all went to university, and they all studied rhetoric, and they all competed, as writers do today, for the top spot in the literary world.
Was he particularly resented because he didn't have an education?
Yes. Greene wrote a great, one of the last things he wrote was this treatise on this upstart crow that he called Will Shakespeare, because he was an upstart. He didn't go to university, and he thought himself better than the university wits who thought that they were at the top of the pack. And history has proven that Greene was wrong, and Shakespeare was the one that we all admire.
My favorite description of Shakespeare, for those who may not really want to see a play, is blah, 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 sword fight.
and Shakespeare was aware of that.
Yes.
There's very few plays that he doesn't have a sword fight because they were appreciated. People wanted to see the sword fights. And most actors at that time, like you and I, Phil, were very good swordsmen. So if you were in a sword fight and you killed someone, normally you'd go to jail for that. But in Elizabethan times, if you could prove to the judge that you could read and write, you were let off.
Really? Wow. That you could read or write?
What if you killed somebody that could read and write?
They'd write it off.
Thank you, Phil. You're way ahead of me.
You were going to say it.
I was going to say it.
What was Shakespeare like personally?
Hard to know. He was very reclusive. He certainly had affairs. One can assume that. He didn't get into trouble. All the playwrights that I've been referring to, they all got into trouble. They all got hauled before court. Shakespeare never did. It may be, in my humble opinion, and it's very humble, that because he was a secret Catholic, he kept his nose clean so that he would not get into trouble.
Mm-hmm.
But there's relatively little known about Shakespeare because he did keep his nose clean. He didn't get into trouble. We know that he lived with a French couple on Silver Street while he was writing the plays, and he was involved in a lawsuit with them, but he wasn't the person involved in the lawsuit. He was merely a witness. But there's relatively little known about him. We do know that that he was not only a playwright but also an actor, and there is a rumor that he played all the kings that weren't the title role. So all the plays that have kings in them but are not the title role, the rumor is that Shakespeare played those parts.
Wow.
Did he speak truth to power and as a result have...
No, he didn't speak truth to power.
So he didn't get into trouble with the powers that be.
There's relatively little politics in his plays. There's politics, but not controversial politics. He pretty much stayed true to the tutors that hired him and kept his nose clean. The other playwrights often did get very political and got hauled into court or brought both courts, whether it was legal court or the Queen's Court, in order to get their comeuppance for doing what they did.
How did he live out his life?
Well, most of the time he lived in London. When he retired, a very rich man, he returned to Stratford, where he got into one or two lawsuits because he was part of a consortium that was buying out the common land, taking common land away from the peasants, away from the people who couldn't afford it. Were using that common land to put their sheep on, their cattle on, and he was part of a consortium that was disappearing that land. He finally pretty much died of a cold. He caught cold and died.
Caught a cold. How old was he?
He was 48, I believe, when he died.
That's a pretty good long life. But he also developed writer's cramp, I understand.
He did.
When you look at his signatures in the later
Well,
days.
right. Now, talking about his signatures.
Imagine that.
There's no such thing as a spelling bee in Shakespeare's time. What do I mean by that? There's no definitive script for Shakespeare because we're never sure really about what words are correct. For instance, Americans tend to say, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, whereas the English tend to say, oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve. And the reason is there is no correct spelling of words in this period of time. You can spell a word any way you like. So going to Phil's comment, in the I don't think this number's right, but in the dozen or so examples of Shakespeare's spelling of his own name on legal documents, in 6 of those, he spells it differently. He spells his own name differently. And in fact, in my novel, I do not spell Shakespeare, Shakespeare, as it is normally written, but I take one of the other spellings, Shakespar, no E at the end. Saves on room in the novel, and is an acknowledgement of the fact that spelling was up for grabs at that
Now, by the way, the Firesign Theater...
That's right, the missing play.
we wrote a Shakespeare's Lost Comedy, right? But we always thought of him as being Shakespeare, which is what you kind of are playing with.
Yes, exactly.
So it was almost as if back then, before spelling was standardized, writing was almost in dialect.
Yes, exactly. It's a good way to put it. It was in dialect.
Yeah.
And that is why, if you look at the first folio for Macbeth, you'll see that it's not written murder, M-U-R-D-E-R.
It's Merthyr.
Merthyr, because somebody in the printing process must have had a Northern English accent, and they wrote it the way it sounded. They said it, Merthyr.
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 Merthyr, Martha. Murphy.
Interesting. What, for you personally, makes him relevant 6 centuries later?
His appreciation of the human existence, and that never really changes. History can change, cultures can change, but the human condition is pretty much the same. We love, we hate, we desire, we need to eat, we need to propagate. All the things that are essential to humanity, he deals with, and in such a beautiful way, and in such an educated way. It's what makes him appreciated by people for all these countless years.
And to take it back to what you're saying about Star Trek, he was very much involved in the friction between people and the frictions and tensions in society and history, you know.
Exactly, Philip. Well put. I'll put that in my next class. That's very good.
Good.
It's timeless.
Yeah.
And again, the beauty of his word construction is just glorious. If we like poetry at all, not that he's always a poet, he's not. And a lot of times he says things that are stupid as well. So it's not like he's brilliant all the time.
Well, what's wrong with that?
Oh, yeah, well, you know.
Oh, the groundlings like it.
Exactly. Sometimes the jokes are so bad, Phil, not even you can make them funny.
Firesign Theater did, but it took 4 of us.
Yeah. But you wrote your own lines.
That's right.
Yeah. But a lot of his work is just, for an actor anyway, as well as a reader, but for an actor, they're just delicious words to speak.
And to get into his speeches, and to get into the scenes, and to kind of uncover the wit and rhetoric, you know, the give and take of what he's doing makes it such a joy. Now, you've done about a third of Shakespeare's tome.
Well, I think I'm a little closer to half.
You've done almost half.
Half the plays.
And how many are there?
That's debatable.
No, that is debatable.
But I think 36 or 37.
Your job as a professor at USC, how many of the students look at Shakespeare as medicine as opposed to candy?
Well, I'm going to brag here. Thank you for that question. It's a wonderful question. Most of my students tell me after they've finished my class and have gone on for another year or so that it was all medicine. They all thought it was medicine when they came in. And certainly my first class is a lot of medicine because I'm introducing them to a language they've never heard before, which is the language of rhetoric. And I'm using a lot of the Greek terms for figures that they have never heard of before. But I will say that I've gotten a ton of feedback from a good majority of my students that it became their favorite class while they went to USC.
Isn't that wonderful?
Because I think they discovered something they didn't know about before, and the discovery of learning became delicious to them.
You've been using the word rhetoric a lot when you're talking about Shakespeare's writing. And this day and age that we're dealing with politically in the United States, rhetoric is
a bad word.
Has become a bad word. So what is the relevance of the word rhetoric in terms of Shakespeare and today?
Great question. Let me answer. That's a two-part question for me. So the first part, what is rhetoric? Rhetoric is the art and science of putting words together to say something meaningful and memorable. For those of us of our generation, we remember Kennedy's ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Right. And that's a very rhetorical sentence. It's put together very rhetorically. Words are repeated, and repetition is part of rhetoric. So it becomes memorable. It's not only do we think it's wise, but we can repeat it because it's easy to repeat because of the mnemonic of the repeated words. Mm-hmm. That was something that all knowledgeable people, all people who wanted to write, had to understand in order to write up until about the 20th century. Everybody learned that. How does it deal with our 21st century problems here in this country? Well, first of all, they've made rhetoric into a bad term because rhetoric in the 20th century became something, you were sold something you didn't want. That was the definition of rhetoric.
Disingenuous.
Yes, it was disingenuous that they spoke so well about a product that you had to buy it, and then when you bought it, you found out it was a dud. Okay. Rhetoric has also come to mean in the 21st century that a particular topic is repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated ad infinitum.
Fraud.
Right.
Fraud.
So that either it takes on a great deal of meaning, or a buzzword, it becomes a buzzword.
Fake news.
Or fake news. Or all value to that word is lost because it's repeated so many times. Mm-hmm. That wasn't the original purposes of rhetoric. Rhetoric was to make you remember it and to value it.
It is interesting that rhetoric has become more of a negative power in our modern vernaculars, hasn't it? You know, but the politicians usurped it.
Yes, and one of the reasons why Shakespeare, it's hard to really, Shakespeare was never intended to be read. It was always intended to be performed.
Very good point.
So when you read it without the actors bringing life to those characters, it's very dull. It's very dull without actors. The second part of the problem is, unlike people like Phil, a lot of times actors don't know what they're saying when they're saying Shakespeare. They don't understand the principles of rhetoric. They don't understand that want means loss and not desire. And so you, as an audience member, are listening to a Shakespeare play, watching a Shakespeare play, and you're confused and you feel stupid because you don't understand what they're saying. The fault is not in you, the audience. The fault is in the actors, that they have not done their homework sufficiently so that they can communicate what's on the page to the audience. There's nothing better for me as an actor to hear an audience member come up to me after a Shakespeare show or a classical show and say, that's the clearest I've ever understood that. And you know what? It was always clear. It's just that the communicators, the actors, hadn't done their work in order to make it clear to you.
That's right.
The plays written in the middle of his career are enormously accessible. The plays written in the beginning of his career are usually very funny and very accessible. The plays written at the end of his career are harder to get into. Why? Like a musician, you start out learning the chords, the simple chords, the simple keys. And as a beginning playwright, he's writing rather simple rhetoric, understandable rhetoric. The language is relatively easy. As a musician progresses and he becomes or she becomes infatuated with jazz, they begin to syncopate. They begin to play with the music.
Improvise.
They improvise. They begin to not be worried about the forms, but decide to take liberties with the forms. And that's what he starts to do with language in his later plays. So plays like The Tempest, Winter's Tale, those are difficult plays to understand because now he's riffing on the English language, and it's not as easy as Hamlet or Comedy of Errors because he's now having fun with language, which he wasn't doing before.
Shakespeare wrote for it to be delivered, not read.
Yes,
Never.
The plays were printed after he died. He
right.
never made any effort to have it. And in fact, the plays didn't belong to Shakespeare. Once he wrote them, they belonged to the theater. They belonged to the theater that he worked for.
The
for
King's
the King's Men
Men?
or the Queen's Men. Absolutely. And in fact, if a printer came into the audience, or a printer's boy or somebody, and he surreptitiously wrote down all the lines and printed that play belonged to the printer, not to the theater, and certainly not to Shakespeare. Wow. And that's why we have some versions of Shakespeare's play, they're called the bad quartos, that were surreptitiously taken down, and they're not close to the first folio at all, and because they were just written as quick as that boy could write down the lines.
It's also my supposition that the great comics, the jesters in his company, would improvise.
I will go further with that, and I'm very proud of this. There were two main comics in Shakespeare's. They didn't work at the same time. One replaced the other. The first one was Will Kemp, and he did exactly what you said. Will Kemp improvised all the time, and I think Shakespeare was very happy to see the back of Will Kemp when Will Kemp left the company. Now, what I love about the fact was the comic character who replaced Will Kemp was a man named, ready for this? Robert Armin. And he was very much a linguistic comic character, and he's the one that created all the great fools. The Fool in King Lear, the Fool in Twelfth Night. He's not a comic. He's not a pratfall type of actor. He's a linguistic. He's as Feste says in Twelfth Night. He is a corrupter of words, and quite brilliant. But all of them had some comedic virtues. Absolutely.
Will Kemp. I wonder if we get camping it up from that.
You know, that's a very
could be right.
So the takeaway is that if you want to get into Shakespeare, go see a good production.
Yes.
Or a good movie.
Go see a good movie, because all the difficult stuff is usually cut out of the movie.
See anything with a number. Richard III, Henry V.
Those are all middle plays, because he was writing histories a lot in his middle years. He was interested in the conflict in English politics without getting too political. But I think a movie's a very good idea because you're startled by the magnificence of the costumes.
Any particular movie you'd recommend?
Henry V is a tremendously inspiring movie. tremendously inspiring.
And easy to understand.
Easy to understand. Because there's a lot of sword fighting.
Armin, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It's been delightful being in your backyard.
Thank you. Our backyard is better off for your having been here.
Thank you so much, Armin.
Another fascinating conversation.
Yeah, and I didn't have to learn any lines.
I really love barging into people's homes and interviewing them. We have to continue doing this. On the next edition of Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show, I'm Ted Bonnet.
And I'm the other guy. Stay tuned. Bye.
You've been listening to Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show, featuring Phil Proctor and Ted Bonnet and their special guest, Armin Shimerman. Music by Eddie Betos and the Nervous Brothers. I'm A. Ernest Guy. Stay tuned for the next episode of Phil and Ted's Sexy Boomer Show, produced by RadioPictures.com, the makers of fine podcasts for seasoned hipsters, man.